This video is focused on our first learning theory. We're going to be looking here at the behaviourism approach. So just for a little bit of context, if you recall, we've looked at the work of Wilhelm Wundt, who was looking at introspection and trying to study the structure of consciousness. And then last time we looked at the psychodynamic approach and the work of Freud. Freud was looking at analysing the unconscious mind through dreams and theorising about different parts of personality in the early 20th century. Freud was huge. He was revolutionary. But psychologists and scientists started to become a bit frustrated with the unscientific nature of his ideas. So scientists, these guys, the behaviourists, we'll spell it with a U in the UK, considered that actually any research about the mind or the unconscious is subjective. It can't be directly observed and studied scientifically, and it can't be falsified. So a big paradigm shift took place between the psychodynamic approach and the behaviourist approach, whereby psychologists stopped trying to study unobservable phenomena like the mind, like Wundt, or the unconscious, and again wanted to just study behaviours which could be directly observed. So behaviourism became the dominant paradigm or the dominant approach to psychology really in the sort of the first half of the 20th century. So the key behaviourists that you need to know, some of you have already encountered. The first is Watson. You may remember him from your study of psychopathology. I'd like you to pause this video at this point and see if you can recall the details of Watson. Seeing this picture of the little baby here with the rabbit or a white rat might help to prompt your memory there. So we've got Watson. Another key behaviourist is Pavlov. He was in fact a Russian scientist. He actually won the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine for research actually about the digestive system. So a pretty impressive guy. He noticed that dogs who he was experimenting on would salivate just at the sound of his footsteps when he was coming to feed them. And he began to wonder about this. And so he conducted really famous research that we now know as classical conditioning. So we'll look at that shortly. And finally, we have B.F. Skinner. He is most famous for his construction of a Skinner box, which we will explore, where he would train rats to press levers for food through the process of operant conditioning. And so he really is the forefather of that type of learning. So the learning approaches, there are different learning approaches. We're looking at behaviourism in this video, and we're going to be looking at classical and operant conditioning. But there's another learning approach, which is social learning theory. And this didn't emerge until more or less the 1960s with the advent of the cognitive approach. But it's still based on a number of the principles of behaviourism. We're going to be looking at social learning theory after the cognitive approach because it is an approach that really merges behaviourism with cognitive psychology. So we'll learn about cognitive approach first, then we'll link it with behaviourism to understand social learning theory. So the specification, this is the first part of the learning approaches. Make sure that you're confident with each of these key terms, and do make sure that you're confident with each of the items on the learning checklist as well. So key assumptions of behaviourism and the behaviourist approach. As I mentioned, behaviourists wanted to move psychology towards a more scientific basis. So in following the more empirical method, they were only interested in behaviour that can be directly observed and measured via experience and precisely measured. As the mind is unobservable, it's within the sort of the black box of the mind, they did not attempt to study mental processes. Instead, they chose to only focus on observable behaviour. For example, lever pressing in rats or dog salivation, for example. So they ignore the mind. They believe that it's inaccessible. It shouldn't be studied. Instead, they're just interested in the association between stimuli and behaviour. So they adopt a stimulus response model, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail. They proposed the idea of basic learning processes. So they think that learning in animals as well as humans is based on just very, very simple stimulus response relationships. And they considered that the processes of conditioning can be seen in both animals and humans. So they favoured the study of animals over humans. So they did lots of studies using rats and pigeons and dogs and monkeys to investigate behaviour and then apply that to humans. They believe that humans are born a blank slate. They use the phrase tabula rasa, blank slate, so that we are not born with any innate tendencies or characteristics, that all behaviour is learned or written on that slate. And this is a concept we've come across before in the learning theory of phobias and attachment. And of course, the behaviourists identified two major forms of learning, and they are classical and operant conditioning. Just a moment on this sort of stimulus response model, just once again. So these learning theories are based on the stimulus response model, which is basically the idea that human behaviour is the result of a series of interactions between a stimulus and a response. And we'll look at this idea as we progress through classical and operant conditioning. But the basic idea is that we hear a stimulus. So for example, we hear a bell ring, and then we salivate in response to it. That's meant to be saliva there. And so there's no need for mental processes. There's no cognition involved. Behaviour is simply a response to a stimuli. For example, if a bell rings at the end of class, we pack up our belongings. We feel thirsty, we get a drink. So behaviourism argues that even really complex actions can be broken down into these stimulus response units. And if we cast our mind back to the study of attachment, even something as complex as love and attachment has been explained in terms of stimulus and response. Crying and then the removal of hunger, for example. Likewise, phobias is the result of an association between that phobic stimulus and something that actually caused us fear in the first place. So at this point in the video, I'd like you to remind yourselves of the processes of classical conditioning by placing the labels here in the correct boxes in the diagram. Some of them go in twice. I'd then like you to watch the following video. Pavlov is one of the major psychologists in behaviourism, and he conducted famous experiments with dogs, studying classical conditioning or learning via association. So I'd like you to pause the video and watch that video. There's going to be a number of tasks for you to complete in relation to that. I'd then like you to identify in Pavlov's research, what is the independent variable? What is the dependent variable? And what were some extraneous variables that he controlled for, and why did he do that? So we can have a look at his little apparatus, his setup here, and here you can actually identify a number of these controls. I'd then like you to use these terms and place them in the correct place in the diagram. So what is the neutral stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, and the conditioned stimulus, and likewise the unconditioned and conditioned responses. So classical conditioning is learning via association between two stimuli. Really important that we know that definition. Learning via association between two stimuli. That's the short way to explain it. The longer definition is learning that occurs when two stimuli, i.e. the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, are repeatedly paired. Classical conditioning is not one-trial learning. It happens over a number of different pairings. The association occurs over time. And the result is that a response, which is first elicited by the unconditioned stimulus, is eventually elicited by the neutral stimulus alone. So as a response that was initially unlearned and occurred due to that unconditioned stimulus now occurs due to the conditioned stimulus. I'd like you to have a think about the different definitions of these different elements of classical conditioning and identify, based on the definition, that key term. And now we move on to look at operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is based on the ideas of B.F. Skinner. He's the key psychologist here. And he coined the term operant conditioning. He wasn't the first person to come up with this idea. There were sort of precursors to this, but he's the one that's credited with kind of the key principles here. And he believed that learning occurs via associating behavior with the consequence that follows it. So this is still learning via association, but this is not associating two stimuli in the case of classical conditioning. This is associating the behavior with a consequence that follows it. So I'm just going to skip to the next slide at this point, and we'll come back just to talk about what we mean by this. So in operant conditioning, a person's behavior is strengthened or weakened by the consequences or the response following their behavior. So this is learning via the behavior and the consequence that follows it. Now remember, in behaviourism language, a consequence isn't necessarily a bad thing. When we use it in everyday language, we might hear somebody say there will be consequences. And it always sounds like, oh, that's a bad thing, I don't want consequences. But actually, consequences can be really positive. By consequence, we're really just talking about any stimulus that follows behaviour. Any stimulus that follows behaviour. And depending on the nature of that stimulus, either it increases the frequency of that behaviour occurring, or it decreases the likelihood of that behaviour being repeated. So if a consequence increases the frequency of behaviour, we refer to it as a reinforcer or reinforcement. Reinforcement increases the frequency of behaviour. But if the consequence decreases the frequency of that behaviour, then we refer to this as punishment. We then have the different types of reinforcement, either positive or negative. And again, I want you to put your sort of normal understanding of these terms aside for the moment. We're not meaning good and bad by positive and negative. Instead, we're talking about addition and subtraction. So we're talking about it in more mathematical terms. Reinforcement increases the frequency of behaviour. It makes it more likely to happen. If we're talking about positive reinforcement, the way that it encourages this behaviour is by adding something pleasant. So the consequence is adding something that is positive to us. So this could be something like a sweet every time you clean your room. It could be a merit at school. It's adding positive reinforcement, increasing the frequency. If we're talking about negative reinforcement, it's reinforcement, so it is increasing the frequency of behaviour being repeated. That's the meaning of reinforcement, increases the frequency of behaviour. But in this case, it's negative reinforcement. Negative meaning the subtraction, the removal of something. And if we think about what this must be, if we're going to encourage behaviour by taking something away, the thing that we take away has got to be something unpleasant. If we're going to get somebody to repeat that behaviour again, we've got to make their life better in some way. So we've got to remove an unpleasant stimulus. So this could be, for example, if people are excellent in class, then we take away the homework that they need to do. Or if somebody is behaving really, really well, they no longer have to clean their room. So we're removing an unpleasant stimulus to help encourage that positive behaviour, that good behaviour. So back to the key theory of operant conditioning here. As I said, this was a theory by B.F. Skinner, this guy here, and he created the Skinner box to carry out experiments with rats and pigeons and other animals as well, but particularly rats. We can see that there's a lever here, and every time the rat pressed that lever, something would happen. Either it could receive a pellet of food. That would be an example of positive reinforcement. It's encouraging lever pressing, reinforcement by adding a pleasant stimulus. Or, actually, we could have the rat press the lever, and this time the electric floor, which was electrocuting the rat, is now switched off. So this is an example of negative reinforcement. Reinforcement because that lever pressing behaviour is more likely to continue. That's going to be repeated, hence this is reinforcement. But this time it's through the removal of an unpleasant stimulus. Negative removal of that electric shock. So Skinner could train the rat to press the lever by either positive reinforcement, adding a pellet of food, or negative reinforcement, removing the electric shock. So I'd like you now to watch this video on operant conditioning. And I'd like you to identify in Skinner's research the IV, the DV, and any extraneous variables that were controlled for, how they were controlled, and why they were controlled. So just a few more words now on reinforcement. It's really important just because it's so common for students to get this mixed up, because the way that behaviourists speak about reinforcement and the words positive and negative is not really the way that we use these terms in everyday life. So it's important that you really, really understand them. If something is reinforcement, it increases the likelihood of behaviour being repeated. In other words, reinforcement encourages behaviour. Reinforcement encourages behaviour either by having the individual receive a rewarding stimulus in the case of positive reinforcement, or by removing an unpleasant stimulus in the case of negative reinforcement. So again, we think about these terms positive and negative in terms of receiving, adding, or removing, subtracting. Positive and negative, adding, removing. In both cases, whether we add a rewarding stimulus or we remove an unpleasant stimulus, the behaviour is more likely to be repeated. The frequency of behaviour increases. Reinforcement always increases the frequency of behaviour. If it is positive reinforcement, it increases the frequency of behaviour by adding a pleasant stimulus. If it's negative reinforcement, it increases the frequency of behaviour by removing an unpleasant stimulus. Punishment always decreases the likelihood or the frequency of behaviour. It makes it less likely that that behaviour is going to be repeated. It might be receiving an unpleasant consequence, so it might be about being told off or receiving a detention, or it could be about the removal of a pleasant stimulus, like prison is about taking away someone's freedoms. So there are positive and negative types of punishment too, but you don't need to know those in too much detail. All you need to know is that punishment decreases the frequency of behaviour recurring. And now another important note, not necessarily for this topic, for approaches, but you will need to look at these in other areas of the specification, like in attachment, like in forensic psychology, and also in schizophrenia as well. This is the idea of primary and secondary reinforcers. Primary reinforcers are those that we are instinctually desirable. Things that inherently elicit a response from us. We don't have to learn them. They are inherently rewarding. So things like food is inherently rewarding. It's in our nature to desire them. Drink, pleasure, all of these things are unlearned. They are primary in that they are sort of biological in nature. Secondary reinforcers, these are in themselves not inherently rewarding. They don't actually have any meaning or innate rewarding properties. The reason that they are reinforcers is because we've learned to associate them. We've conditioned their association with something else that is inherently rewarding. So for example, money in itself has absolutely no value to us. It only has value because we can trade it for primary reinforcers. We can buy food with it. We can buy security and safety with it. So money in itself is useless unless we can associate it with a primary reinforcer. Likewise, tokens. We will learn about token economies a lot next year. A token is sometimes used in prisons or psychiatric hospitals to reward good behavior. If you engage in therapy, you get a token. Those tokens themselves actually don't represent anything inherently rewarding, but what we can do is trade them in for something that is. Something like choosing food at the canteen, or having an outing, or having more time for exercising, for example. So what I'd like you to do is take a moment to color code here. You can pick your colors, and I'd like you to circle primary reinforcers in one color and secondary reinforcers in a different color. I'd then like you to complete this comparison table. So for these ideas, I want you to circle 1. Classical conditioning is either involuntary or voluntary. Circle whichever one is relevant, and likewise the same for operant, and work your way through this table, please. And then finally, please complete this 6-mark AO1 summary of the key principles of behaviourism. So take your key terms and fill in those gaps.